Thank you so much, colleagues. It's great to be here, to be flying around and be in a kind of like a space cadet. There are some slides which are hopefully going to just show, and as I talk, because I want to go back to the beginning of where this work began for me, and it began more than 20 years ago, writing a book about human remains collecting in Southern Africa, which Martin Legassic and I argued lay at the foundation of the modern museum in South Africa, but that these weren't just the remains of long dead people. They were the remains of people who had just died. Where museums were entering into contracts and deals with grave robbers, and sometimes they were even selecting the remains of people before they had died. And this was a very peculiar time at the beginning of the 20th century when South Africa was becoming a white nation. And because it was going through its process of national formation, it decided that the collecting activities of foreign researchers, of European researchers, were out of order, and that South Africa had a prior right to hold onto these remains. They were largely from the Northern Cape. And today I want to talk, the region I'm talking about is in the part of the Northern Cape that we call Kuruman, in the Kuruman district. And it goes back to a farm, Pinar Spitz, near Gamopedi, where the assistant to Rudolf Puch, the Austrian anthropologist, a man by the name of Meniarto, disinterred the corpses of two farm workers who had just recently died of malarial fever. And these corpses were pressed into a barrel and filled with salt, broken at the knees, and placed on an ox wagon. And on that journey, Meniarto, Puch's assistant, also opened up the graves of three more people, Ko, Masebi, Kruisband, who had also just died, and he boiled their corpses down to skeleton on the spot, according to the way he was instructed. And these remains were exported to Austria as skeletons. And at the time that this collecting was happening, that Puch undertook this field expedition, pretending to be the lone heroic researcher, the South African state in formation decided that collecting activity was illegal. And at the time, Southern Africa's first law on heritage, called the Bushman Relics Act, was also in preparation. And this was not merely a law to prohibit the export of rock engravings, but it was a law to prohibit the export of human remains. And because of this illegality, and because Klaas and Troy Pinar's corpses had been exported whole as corpses and had existed as corpses in these collections for a number of decades before they were macerated, and because, I want to add, the Natural History Museum in Vienna also found that they had the remains of Jewish children in their collection. Very late, the remains of Jewish children. They decided that they wanted to return these remains. And a negotiation process was set in motion in which we argued that the remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar are part of a whole collection of remains from Southern Africa, and were also assembled at the same time as artworks, material culture, and what we call documentation, photographs, sound recordings, film, multimedia expeditions. And the Austrians at the time were celebrating this pioneering scientist, Austria's first professor of anthropology. And we agreed that we would do a restitution of the two ancestors. And we would, thereafter, we would put, as we put it then, your scientists and our scientists together, and we would arrive at an agreed upon inventory, and then to negotiate the return of human remains, material culture, and documentation. Because the trouble with our discussions about restitution is that they are taking place inside of the very disciplines and disciplinary divisions of the Colonial Museum. Our discussions of human remains restitution is a separate discussion from the return of artworks and material culture, where our European colleagues make an assumption of care, and they work with the myth of the gift, where cultural anthropology is deemed to be an unviolent domain of collecting and museum making, as opposed to human remains, which certainly in Germany by now they accept that it is out of order. All human remains must be returned. That is accepted now. And I've just come from a meeting in Berlin where 925 sets of human remains from Rwanda are set to return to Kigali, where the human remains of colonial racism will meet the human remains of the genocide. And we will all be able to witness what that is going to mean. But where we are also beginning the process of the return of remains that are in Berlin to Cameroon and to Togo, where the Berlin authorities are attending to the former German colonial histories. So a number of questions are arising for us. How do you do a return? How do you do a restitution? And we use the term restitution deliberately because the older term that we used to use, repatriation, is a term for European gift making. That is why they like that term. Restitution is a category that demands that these processes are led by African people and that you have a claims-based process. A claims-based process that builds African capacities. This is what it has to be. So there is no template, and we went through a process with the return of Klaas and Troy Pienaar, who were introduced to us in the middle of a meeting by the physical anthropologist who said, and if you want to meet them, they are just behind you in those boxes. And she went up to the boxes and lifted Troy Pienaar's, she lifted her, what is this part of the body? Her hips. She lifted her hips and she said, you can see she is someone who had had children. Because these remains for her had already become objects. So we began using the term rehumanization. And we have been criticized for that. Because it is almost as if we have come to believe the colonial lie that the remains of our ancestors that entered the museum are not the remains of humans, and that we have to reinaugurate them as humans. But for us, this was a politics of reversing the dehumanization, of reversing the dehumanization in life, and reversing the dehumanization in the museum, of being turned into serial objects, being turned into objects of race, placed in a box. And we demanded from the Austrians that they will be returned as people, that they will be returned through ceremonies, through cultural ceremonies, and that they will be returned in coffins. Austrians told us, well, that's impossible. The European law does not allow that. And if you insist on that, then we will bury them right here in Vienna. And luckily, the politicians and the diplomats were extremely skilled, and they were able to come to an arrangement of a restitution as human beings. So what were the ceremonies that we did? Because one of the major questions that troubles us is, how do you do it? Our German colleagues think that one museum can undertake a restitution to a community in an African country. As easy as that. Well, I'm sorry. This is about questions of sovereignty. It does involve a state-to-state process. But it cannot be left at a state-to-state process. It has to involve the decision-making of people in local communities. That is decisive as we think through this. And a number of ceremonies were had, a number of consultation meetings, where it turned out in the meetings that there was a cultural memory of the collecting by the scientists, that people remembered Troy Pienaar as having been Troy Padmaker before she married Klaas Pienaar, when they had become farm workers, when most likely they had been put to flight by the genocide in southern Namibia, had crossed over into South Africa and had become farm workers. There was a cultural memory, and one of the arguments I think that we have made is that one of the reasons why people stopped speaking Mu, which was the San language in that region, was because if you spoke Nama, or what we call Khoi Khoi Guvab, or if you spoke Afrikaans, then the scientists would not be interested in your graves, because you would simply just be hybrid people. You would not be pure people, because they were interested in racial purity. You've seen images of Petrus Faalboy, someone who was involved in negotiations with UNESCO, extremely skilled, who performed the first ceremony in the front room of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and introduced all the members of the delegation to them in the room and explained to them what we had come to do. It was, in many ways, a secular process. It was a secular process that recognized this for the history that was being made, for the history of collecting, and of the need for them to go back to their people. There were other ceremonies that took place, including the burning of Mpepu, or Koyogut, as it is also called, and of the ashes from that Mpepu, collected, assembled, to be put into the coffins in Kuruman at the time of the reburial. So, rehumanization is something that we need to think about. There's one final problem that I want to put to you, something that we need to worry about, because these are processes that are dealt with by governments. They're dealt with by states. They have to be funded. And governments deal with things in certain ways. They have their own language. They have a language which some of you have already heard about, which we call social cohesion. We have to do this for social cohesion. By the way, that's a World Bank term. But the troubling thing that we need to worry about is whether the return of Klaas and Troipina and of other ancestors through the rituals that incorporate the rituals of the state, whether that involves the possibility of deepening their missingness because they are being returned in such symbolic ways, not as individuals, but as representatives of a certain kind of history. And I worry about the incorporation of these restitutions into the logics of the National Memorial Complex. As you can imagine, our Rwandan colleagues are already planning the possibility of the creation of a museum of human remains. Rwanda is the home of the memorial with human remains inside of them, because they want to shame those who allowed the genocide to happen. You know, how do you do a return? Is this a return for burial? How do we memorialize in a way that brings dignity, that brings healing, but that holds on to the violence of the history, and that continues to put it in the face of the Europeans that did this to our people? These are such complex issues that we have to deal with. And we must never allow that separation between our ancestors and our ancestral artworks and objects, for that separation to be reinforced. We must insist on a collective restitution process of our ancestors and their objects and their artworks and the documentation that was made at the time. This has to be a full-scale restitution that has to be accompanied by reparatory work. Restitution is not something that happens overnight. It's not an event in a garden of a government building in an African city. This is work that we have to do for at least another generation. Thank you.